Hey troops, what's going on? Dit Commando here. Welcome to the channel. My name's Ryan and I'm a former Royal Marine from the United Kingdom, and today we're going to be reacting to What If? World Without the United States Part 1. Now I can't even imagine to begin to think about what the world would be like if we didn't have the United States. I mean, just from a military perspective, it would be terrible. You know, they're world police at the end of the day. They are the bodyguards of the world. They are the moral compass for all of our nations, really. Whether you agree with that or not, that's fine. But that's just my interpretation of how they are. You know, we need a figurehead who's in charge, and I think they're a great figurehead, so to speak. So this one, part one, is going to be a really, really good opportunity for us to explore what would it be like without the United States. Before we do get into it, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Let's get to that 100,000. And I just want to say a personal thanks to every single one of you guys. I did a live question and answer the other day, and the amount of positive feedback that I got from every one of you guys was absolutely overwhelming. I really do appreciate it. I am very humbled by you all for the wonderful comments, and it just inspires me to keep on doing this, okay? Amidst all of the original concerns I had with making YouTube videos, you guys have certainly put them to bed, so thank you. Let's enjoy this video.
When you're popular, everyone loves to hate you. And if you're American, then you should be able to admit that throughout history, the US has done things that deserve being hated for. And if you're not American, then you should be able to admit that throughout history, the US has done things that it deserves being loved for. Yet, as the world's sole superpower, the US's influence spreads around the world, in both good and bad ways. What would happen, though, if the US didn't exist anymore? Or at least if its influence across the world stage disappeared overnight? World War II ends in a stalemate. Armchair historians love to point out that the moment Hitler invaded Russia, he was doomed to failure, and thus World War II would have been won by the Allies even without the US. Yet historical truth is not quite that simple. Invading Russia was a critical mistake made by Hitler, and one worsened when the US joined the war and reopened the Western Front in Europe. Yet, what if the US had simply shrugged its shoulders when Russia and Britain begged it to join the war effort? Despite a superior fleet, Britain's war material supply was running dangerously low, even with constant American resupply.
Yeah, Britain, you know, our kind of World War II was, you know, Britain has a fantastic fighting spirit, but let's face it, wars can only be won with the correct stockpile of munitions, weaponry, and the ability to manufacture those weapons and munitions in a timely manner. And Britain just didn't have the facilities and ability to be able to do that in the time frame necessary. It's where America came in, okay, and more so as well. Without America, we would have, you know, really, 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 really struggled.
Efforts. Without the US to ship war goods to Britain, the best that the United Kingdom could have done is stave off a German invasion. In war games carried out in the early 2000s by a British think tank, it was discovered that Hitler could never have successfully overcome Britain's fleets, the RAF, or the Home Guard in a cross-channel invasion. Yet this war game was undertaken with constant US resupply efforts underway. Without these
See, that's exactly what I'm saying. In terms of our military dominance, yes, we would have been able to capitalize on that, and Hitler wouldn't have been able to do very well. However, it was that resupply. It was the backbone, which was America.
Supply efforts, a cross-channel invasion would probably still have been disastrous for Germany, but then again, Germany would have had little need to invade Britain without the US supplying it. A token defensive force could have been left behind in France in order to discourage British invasion, and the full might of the Wehrmacht could have been dispatched to the Eastern Front. Not just reviled as a madman and mass murderer, Stalin was also famously a very poor strategic thinker. He was so surprised by Hitler's invasion that in the years leading up to it, he had taken almost zero precautions against German hostility. To make matters worse, his political purges prior to World War II had decimated the ranks of the Red Army and eliminated most of its experienced commanders. Despite having exponentially greater numbers and firepower advantage in the Winter War of 1939 against Finland, the smaller and much more poorly equipped Finnish army managed to absolutely decimate the Red Army before overwhelming numbers alone forced it.
Yeah, and we've done a few videos regarding Finland's in Finland as well in terms of their fighting spirit. They are warriors through and through. They might not be the biggest military, but they certainly share the warrior spirit, guys.
Defeat. By the time of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, little had improved in the Red Army in the way of command and control, logistical support, or even training. When Hitler invaded, his troops many of the Soviet Union's agricultural regions, leaving the nation to face mass starvation. If it hadn't been for the US's Lend-Lease aid program to the wartime allies, providing food, raw materials, tanks, planes, ammunition, clothing, and everything in between. The United States provided critical aid to the Soviet Union in its most desperate hour. American raw materials fueled Soviet factories that churned out tanks, and thousands of Studebaker trucks helped move goods around the nation and its troops to the front lines. Warm winter clothing kept Soviet soldiers from freezing to death, and American rations fed both soldiers and civilians alike. As Soviet General Georgy Zhukov said after World War II, "We didn't have explosives, gunpowder.
Right then, here's a question actually for you guys. What do you think would have happened if the United States didn't aid not just Britain but the other European countries in World War II? What do you think would have happened as a result, guys? Apart from the obvious, what do you think would have been the little problems that the European allies would have faced? I mean, they've mentioned one thing there with Great Britain. You know, the resupply just wouldn't have existed, which would have evidently had massive consequences. What are the other ones? Let me know in the comments.
We didn't have anything to charge our rifle cartridges with. The Americans really saved us with their gunpowder and explosives. And how much sheet steel they gave us. How could we have produced our tanks without American steel? But now they make it seem as if we had an abundance of all that. Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with. Immediately after the invasion of the Soviet Union, the United States gave the nation an interest-free loan of $1 billion, or about $17.5 billion in today's dollars, worth of...
Wow. Okay, that's a lot of money. A lot of money. And money talks in war, guys. It talks an awful lot. It's a language of its own. Many would say that money is one of the main factors of war. You know, it's you got to look at the beneficiaries of the money in war. Normally, you'll find the cause of it.
Supplies and raw materials. The United Kingdom was also given an initial lease of between 40 and 50 destroyers. Per the terms of the Lend-Lease, the materials were lent for the duration of the war and expected to be returned or reimbursed only upon war's end if they were kept for civilian use. Any combat losses would not be expected to be repaid. Basically, the US lent the Allies surplus military equipment under the condition that it didn't have to be repaid for unless it was kept after the war was over. In total, the US gave the Soviet Union 44,000 Jeeps, 375,883 trucks, 8,071 tractors, 12,700 tanks, 1,541,590 blankets, 331,066 liters of alcohol, 15,400,000.
Alcohol. I mean, I know alcohol's been used in the military for centuries as a and not only a means of morale, but it creates that fighting spirit. And another thing that isn't touched on an awful lot is it's certainly not in modern day military culture, but ancient military culture, drugs, the use of drugs was quite prominent, all right? And you'll still see that in some lesser militaries around the world to this day. You know, in Afghanistan, the use of opiates and marijuana is quite prevalent, okay? And I think that would be a good video to potentially react on. I can't remember where I watched it, but it was a while back now, talking about the use of drugs in ancient war, and it was quite a prevalent substance actually. You know, the use of drugs and how people used to act upon it and stuff, and you know, you get that courage, don't you, from certain drugs. And even in World War I and II, the use of amphetamines for long-range reconnaissance missions in planes and stuff, that's where half of these drugs were kind of mainly utilised and experimented on. The Royal Marines were first experimented on LSD and its effects on leadership and stuff, and it's an interesting topic actually.
117,000 pairs of military boots, 106,893 tons of cotton, 2,670,000 tons of petroleum products and fuel, and 4,478,000 tons of food. It's clear that without the US, the best the Allies could have hoped for would have been a stalemate. with Germany holding on to the richest parts of the Soviet Union and expelling Britain off the mainland. No European Union. Immediately after the end of the Second World War, Europe found itself in shambles. Nearly all of its financial and industrial networks had been destroyed in the fierce fighting, and entire national economies had collapsed. The war had been the most devastating in human history, and the fate of entire nations hung by a thread. 2.5 years after the end of fighting, there was very little sign of recovery from the European mainland, with millions of homeless and out of work. Then, in 1948, the U.S. Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, drafted up a 4-year plan meant to reinvigorate the European economy. The plan would rely on $15 billion of financial aid, or $250 billion in today's dollars, and it would be completely financed by the American taxpayer. The first target of the
Wow, okay, what's your thoughts on that one? I want some American comments below. What do you feel about that being financed by the American taxpayer? I want to hear your thoughts below and your reasons why.
Marshall Plan, as it came to be known, would be feeding the European population, as a massive famine was threatening the mainland. Thus, food aid was immediately dispatched to 16 European nations. The Soviet Union and its satellite states had been offered assistance as well, but it had turned it down due to fears of meddling by the US in internal affairs. The main focus of the Marshall Plan was on the recovery of Europe's largest industrial powers, such as West Germany, France, and Great Britain, as it was believed that if these great economies were jump-started, then the effects would spread to other nations. Attempts to rebuild national shipping fleets, road and railway infrastructure, and reconstruct devastated cities were bolstered by American aid money, though the effect of the Marshall Plan is likely less economic and more political. Due to the Soviet Union's refusal to partake in any reconstruction efforts, the Marshall Plan and the 16 nations it aided helped establish the political framework for what post-World War II Europe would look like, with the West firmly aligned in solidarity against the communist East. The Marshall Plan seeded the idea of European unity and fostered an intertwining of European interests, which was President Truman's greatest goals, as only a unified Europe could stand against the Soviet Union. But also, only a unified Europe could avert another world war. Without the Marshall Plan, European economies would have taken longer to recover than they did, which would have made them more vulnerable to political revolutions fostered by the Soviet Union, whose agents were constantly at work attempting to make the ideology of Soviet revolution abroad or of spreading communist revolutions around the world a reality. The Marshall Plan, however, also laid down the political and economic roots for what would become the European Union. And without it, it's very likely that Europe would have returned to the old power way of thinking that had dominated European politics for centuries. European colonialism prevails. Prior to World War II, European powers retained colonies across the world, and upon entering the Second World War, President Roosevelt made it extremely clear to the Allies that America's help was dependent on the eventual liberation of the majority of these colonial holdings, with their
Right, so the intervention of that meant that, it led the way for for independence to prevail, and it's something that America's been quite proud of from their own stance in their own country and independence. They fought for it. Okay, yes, I'm from Great Britain, and we all know how the War of Independence went there. But I do believe in independent democracies being created, and the right of having that independence is the ultimate freedom, and freedom is everyone's right. So I'm all for it, guys. And the fact that they paved the way for those independent countries to prevail in Europe, I admire that, and I don't think anyone can argue that, really. So they're massively important. We tend to look at America. A lot of people will have mixed bag viewpoints on them. They'll see them invading countries and stuff, and we've all got our conspiracy theory reasons. But when you look at it, I generally believe that America has everyone's correct interests at heart. Put it that way. Okay, I've worked alongside these men and women, and they're a fantastic breed of people.
Feet to the fire, Britain and France were forced to agree, and after the end of the war, President Truman made it a top priority to ensure that Britain and France, as well as other European powers, held true to their promises to begin liberating their colonies. Though the process was slow, the end of colonialism was much the result of the economic collapse of Europe's great powers, as it was the sheer determination of American presidents to see Europe relinquish its old ways. Without the United States, European colonialism would have continued and may in fact have worsened. With their economies in shambles, European powers would have leaned even harder on their colonial states, bleeding their economies dry in an effort to rebuild themselves. This would have sparked violent insurgencies around the world, which would have brought with them harsh crackdowns by the colonial powers. In the end, the death of European colonialism would have taken decades more to arrive, and the world today may in fact look a lot more like it did during the age of the great powers. Korea.
Yeah, so in that respect, I'm very thankful for the intervention and the fact that the United States was there to help us in that process, guys.
Unified under the North, and Japan rises as an imperial power once more. Today, South Korea is a vibrant and prosperous nation, while its neighbor to the north is facing mass starvation and economic desolation. Yet the entire Korean peninsula would look very different today if it were not for the US. 2 days after the start of the war, the UN published Resolution 83, urging UN members to lend military aid to the South. A UN coalition force was ultimately formed, but it was the US that would do the heavy lifting. The war would end 3 years later after China's involvement, with the US not desiring to see the situation evolve into another major war that would now include China. If the US had not been available to defend the South, the war would have been won by the North far too quickly for the UN to marshal a sizable military response. In the entire
And with regard to South Korea, guys, we've seen to this day America's peacekeeping motive take place. They're still there helping South Korea. And South Korea is a fantastic country in comparison to its northern counterpart, and it's such a shame, really. And you look at how good America's been in terms of stabilizing that area ever since 1953. It's only been for the good. You've got so many millions of people in South Korea benefiting from that peace, and it's nice. I've got a lot of time for that.
The entire peninsula would have been reunited under the North. Communism would have overtaken the South, and while we may be tempted to compare the fate of a communist peninsula with that shared by the North today, it's important to remember that the state of the North's economy is largely the result of US-led sanction efforts against the Kim regime. Without the US to lead these sanctions and under the protection of a growing China, the unified Korean peninsula would be in a stronger economic state than the North is today. If it would have been more prosperous than South Korea is today is debatable. But what isn't is that a communist Korea wouldn't necessarily be as impoverished as the North is today. A communist Korea would have naturally gravitated toward China and become a satellite state. This would have upended Asian politics as we understand them today. Japan, for one, would have been quick to ditch its pacifist ideologies, which were only ever truly possible as a result of Japan enjoying the protection of the United States. Faced with a hostile China, Japanese nationalistic hardliners would have upended the Constitution and rewritten it to allow Japan to once more field a military capable of both offensive and defensive operations. Even today, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is a member of a right-wing nationalistic party, which in the past advocated a return to imperial power. Japan would have risen as a military power once more, and conflict in Asia would be all but unavoidable. The second half of the 20th century would have been dramatically different without US intervention, and it's likely that communism would have dominated the global stage both militarily and politically. Whereas today,
so I mean, I don't know too much about communism, guys, but it seems to me where the free countries fail, communism seems to prevail, and it's that search for dominance overriding man's abilities for freedom. You've got one or two top dogs wanting to control the masses, and it seems to me that failing countries in that respect always turn towards communism. I mean, I'm no expert on the whole matter, but it just seems that the choice would be simple for me. Go towards democracy and freedom, and let many people enjoy those the freedoms. But I don't know, guys. It's a complicated subject, but North Korea would have seemed so much better if they just give up that rule. But again, this is the beauties of our world. It's different for a reason, Many people have been to North Korea and said it's a wonderful place, and I've also heard many people say it's terrible,
Mostly strong democratic states. We could in fact have seen a reverse of this, with the world as we know it being made.
Sorry for that, guys. I've just pressed the wrong button there. So many are thinking that I'm actually... No, there's an outro already.
up of a collection of communist states where the democracies are the minority. What would that have meant for global civil rights movements? We can only guess, but in part 2, we'll take a look at how the world may have looked as it entered the 21st century in a world without the US. What do you...
Right.
The best way to make money with Amazon.
Let's have a chat. Troops. I need to stop doing that, actually. I'm keep on pressing onto different scenes by accident. But yeah, I mean, the world without the US, in terms of if they didn't intervene in World War II, it would have been very different for Great Britain. Selfishly, I'm thinking, wow, it would have been extremely different, guys. Difficult to comprehend as well, the changes that would have been implemented as a result of the US not getting involved, but they're our big brother for a reason. Or should I say, yeah, they're certainly instrumental in many of our efforts around the globe, and they've been the overriding factor of change, which is a good thing. I think change in a positive way can never be a negative, so to speak. I really enjoyed that video. I look forward to part 2, guys. If you enjoyed that video, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. If you want to become a member like my wonderful members, press the join button. Link is in the description. And while we're on that subject, thank you, members. I really do appreciate you guys. Until next time, peace.